The Civil Rights Movement created by Jordan Reif. Segregation divides America. After Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, where the Supreme Court ruled separate but equal, segregation took hold in the South. There are two types of segregation, de jure and de facto. De jure segregation is segregation that is enforced by law. An example would be the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, where it ruled separate but equal. De facto segregation is segregation that is enforced by tradition. An example of this would be an African American could not speak to a white civilian unless spoken to first. That would be classified as enforced by tradition. Everything in the South was segregated, even cemeteries. Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 basically overruled Plessy versus Ferguson when Supreme Court Justice John Marshall stated that separate is not equal in public schools. This really got the ball rolling for civil rights because now public schools cannot be segregated. Little Rock Nine is probably the most famous group of African American students to integrate into a high school. They volunteered to integrate into Little Rock High School in Arkansas, but Governor Faubus actually called out the National Guard to stop these students from entering the high school. When President Eisenhower found this out, he overruled Governor Faubus and sent federal troops to the school to protect the African American students. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 established the United States Civil Rights Commission, which had the power to investigate violations of civil rights, and it also gave the U.S. Attorney General greater power to protect the voting rights of African Americans. In the picture, you see President Eisenhower signing the Civil Rights Act into law. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 all started when Rosa Parks would not give up her seat to a white male. She was arrested and jailed because of it. Dr. King organized the bus boycott to basically protest Rosa Parks being arrested, and no African Americans would ride any city buses for a year. Montgomery ultimately desegregated their buses. The SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was founded by Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy. They advocated nonviolence and organized a series of protests such as the Prayer Pilgrimage in Washington, D.C. In the picture, you see Dr. King and other SCLC leaders marching in Birmingham. SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was funded by Ella Baker, who was previously active in the NAACP and pictured down in the corner. The goal of SNCC was to create a grassroots movement that involved all classes of African Americans in the struggle to attain equality. They practiced sit-ins at lunch counters to desegregate the restaurant. A lot of college students were members of SNCC, so what they would do is they would do exactly what it says, sit in at a lunch counter, and refuse to move unless they were served. They received a lot of violence from white civilians in their restaurants and brutality, but the students would just sit there and take it until the restaurant would ultimately serve them. Freedom rides became popular after the Supreme Court case Boynton versus Virginia in 1960. That Supreme Court case stated that segregation on interstate buses and in waiting rooms was illegal. After this decision, CORE organized freedom rides into the Deep South. 2 buses left from Washington, D.C., headed for New Orleans. The buses tried to test to see if this law was actually being enforced in the South. The ride was going great until about Alabama, where it turned dangerous. In Anniston, someone firebombed one of the buses, and in Birmingham, a white mob attacked the other riders. The March on Washington took place August 28, 1963. There was more than 200,000 demonstrators, more than double of what they expected. The goal was to put pressure on Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, and the highlight of the day was Martin Luther King giving his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, and it banned segregation in public accommodations. The act also allowed the Justice Department to persecute individuals who violated people's civil rights and outlawed discrimination in employment on account of race, color, sex, or national origin. It also established the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The EEOC took complaints from people who felt that they were being discriminated against in an employment on account of race, color, sex, or national origin. In the picture, you see Dr. King shaking President Johnson's hand after signing the bill. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned poll tax and literacy tests. It established the 24th Amendment and limited racial gerrymandering because of the court cases Baker v. Carr and Reynolds v. Simmons. Racial gerrymandering, what they did was they would create a district of African Americans, and so that only one person represents all those African Americans instead of having a little bit of African Americans in each district to be like diverse. They would just put them in their own district and only have one representative for them. The movement turns violent, however, when civil rights activists feel that civil disobedience is not working anymore. Malcolm X was the most well-known African American radical. He had a difficult childhood and ended up in prison at the age of 21. In prison, he converted to the Nation of Islam, a religious sect headed by Elijah Muhammad, which demanded separation of the races. In 64, he broke away from the Nation of Islam, but sadly in 65, he was assassinated by 3 Nation of Islam members. The Black Panthers is probably the most well-known civil rights activist organization that are violent. They were formed by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, and were the symbol of young militant African Americans. They would take armed patrols of urban cities to make sure African Americans were not receiving police brutality, but they also organized anti-poverty programs. They started the trend of afros and referring to themselves as black instead of Negro or African Americans. As you see in the picture, on the top, there is a group of Black Panther members wearing all leather and hats, and then at the bottom, you see them with rifles. The end.